Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You can see me, but I can't see you. So what I'm going to do is perhaps speak for 15 minutes or so to introduce some of the themes of the book, but then we can hopefully engage in a bit more discussion about Russia. There are two things that I'd like to try to do with my remarks. First is that I want to try to, well, I will frame why I wrote the book and what I want to try to do with it. The second is then to sketch out some of the main points in my argument, keeping my remarks fairly brief so that we can engage in Q&A. So the book Power in Modern Russia is an attempt to try to offer a clear answer to a question that has featured persistently in the public debate about Russia since 2014, when there was the outbreak of war in Ukraine. That question is does the Russian leadership, and usually Vladimir Putin, have a grand strategy, or is he making it up as he goes along? Now, there are some variations on this, to be sure. Is Mr. Putin a grand strategist or merely a tactician? Is he working on the basis of strategy, or is he merely seizing opportunities as and when they come? Since I began to plan the book and then since I wrote it and then published it, this has become, I think, an increasingly important question. 3 or 4 reasons why that's the case. The first is that there's a series of increasingly serious disagreements between Moscow on the one hand and the Euro-Atlantic community on the other. Part of this, the second reason, is the natures of the wars in both Syria and Ukraine, linking on to what is now being called in Brussels and Washington and London the emergence of a great power competition. Much of the discussion about Russia in policy circles, it seems to me, and increasingly in think tank and academia too, is therefore about the nature of the relationship we should be trying to achieve with Russia. Do we need to have dialogue with Russia on the one hand? Do we need to try to deter Russia, or should we be defending against Russia? And all of those 3 points seem to me to depend considerably on whether Russia has a grand strategy or not, and our understanding of that. What I try to do with the book is to provide an algorithm for Russian activity. When I was first in discussion with MUP about this, we thought that there were 2 options really. One was to write a book of about 30,000 words, sketching out what we mean by strategy and Russian grand strategy. And the other was effectively to go the full distance and to cover it all, therefore ending up with a multi-volume book of about 300,000 words. I opted for the former happily, and the result is this. What I hope is that this will be a useful, concise means of understanding Russian strategy and how we can understand that in today's context. I'm not going to be covering, therefore, each and every case of possible questions, not really about Russian strategy in Ukraine or China or the US. What I want to do is set out some form of algorithm for understanding Russian grand strategy, the things to look for, and the basic points that we need to be aware of. With the book also, what I want to try to get into is how we understand strategy, but based on Russian evidence. So I want to push well beyond the just looking at Mr. Putin's role, and to track beyond that into looking at change and continuity, effectively picking through a trajectory of Russian policy, really from about 2000 to about 2018. The particular focus of the book is really not what is happening so much as how things work in Russia, and importantly how they do not. So it's really about mechanics and how, rather than what, I suppose you could say. And third, I wanted therefore to dig in on that respect to look into whether there is any crossover between how governments work. When we talk about Russian strategy, are we talking in completely different terms to those that we might discuss with, let's say, British strategy or US strategy? So let me now turn to the argument of the book. The first point of that is, what do we mean by strategy? And this is quite important because usually when we have a discussion about Russian strategy, the terms are used synonymously between strategy and tactics and policy and goals. What are Russian goals? Therefore, is that synonymous with Russian strategy? What I mean by strategy is the attempt to create power, the bringing together of ways and means and ends in an executive process. What we're doing, therefore, really is looking at not just plans and planning, but the implementation of those plans. And that's really the distinction that I want to dig into. So therefore, we're talking about, on the one hand, the handling of resources, yes, but most importantly, and the thing I'll focus on today is what you would call the conducting of the orchestra. The conducting of the orchestra of Russian power, the various ministries and agencies and departments, because strategy is essentially, it depends on people following the script. As soon as there is deviation from the script, as Lawrence Friedman, our own academic strategist, reminds us, as soon as people deviate from the script, that's where you have problems. So with that in mind, where are we? In my view, and as the book tries to set out, we are witnessing the rebirth of Russian grand strategy. I think that there's little doubt about that. We see certainly many problems with it. We see many questions, so it's a protracted process. But the Russian leadership itself is very clear in its intentions in this regard. The attempt is there to shape and to create strategy. There's a structure, architectural policy structure created. There's a legislative basis for this now, and on that basis, there are now certainly over the last 10 years or so, tens of thousands of documents that have been framed as creative planning documents, as concepts, as strategies, and so on. These are from the national security strategy, foreign policy concepts, and so on, which are more visible to the audiences in the UK, ranging all the way through to food strategies, energy strategies, and so on, and a web of, for instance, Arctic strategies. What the book focuses on, though, particularly is something called a series of documents called the May Decrees from 2012. And these, I think, provide the basis of a strategic agenda that the Russian leadership has. And I think there are two goals in that sense. One is to drag Russia into the 21st century. The other is to try to position the state to be prepared to withstand what the Russian leadership sees as a very competitive 2020s. The agenda is huge. And there's across a whole range of different aspects. I mean, it's worth pointing out that there are 11 documents in this, 9 of which are all domestic focused, from infrastructure development to housing and utilities and interethnic relations and education. 2 focus on military questions, 1 domestic and 1 external, and 1 focuses on foreign policy. The agenda being vast, there are a number of questions about how one might think about these documents as well. Certainly the Russian leadership itself and many other Russian observers criticize them for being vague, for being imprecise and using terms enhance and engage and having too little detail to actually practically implement. They're also held up by the uncertainty of planning. How do you go about planning in an uncertain world, dealing with the fog and the friction of day-to-day events, the opposition of events, as you might call it. The real problem, though, with regards to Russian strategy is not so much therefore in planning, which has become more and more sophisticated in some senses, at least in its structure, but with the implementation. And that's where the book really tries to dig into this. So what we're looking at is three or possibly 4 sets of problems. The first is the overall background of the condition of Russia since the end of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. The inheritance of this Russian leadership is such that the geography, the infrastructure, the geography making strategy difficult, the infrastructure being often limited and decrepit, means that the overall condition of the Russian context, the Russian policy environment, is very difficult for a strategist to create power. The second is the problem of coordination of resources. Most of the strategic agenda that was framed in May Decrees of 2012 was based on the growth of 4 to 5%, GDP growth of 4 to 5%. A lot of that actually has not, though, taken shape since. The Russian economy quickly began to sink into recession middle of the decade and has rarely reached beyond 2% since. Interestingly, for our comparison with, let's say, with other governments, also it's worth pointing out that a major problem with implementation has been coordination between ministries. The Russian orchestra of ministries has never been very harmonious. The Russians themselves have a word, if we call it departmentalitis in the UK, you could easily call it Ведомственность in Russia, where each of the ministries looks after their own interests rather than a broader common one. Most interesting to my mind, though, is the sense of dysfunction in the chain of command, the vertical of power. Often we find that there's lots of evidence to show that direct orders from the leadership are simply not implemented, or implemented only tardily. And when I was preparing this, there was a discussion even amongst Russian MPs and Russian observers of the concern about systemic sabotage within the Russian body politic. Often you find examples where instructions are only implemented up to about 20%. One of my favorite quotes is when Mr. Putin in 2013 went to the Russian Far East, which was a priority and remains so. He met the local authorities and said, well, we've planned this for over a year now, and yet you've implemented only 20% of what we agreed. Why? In the end, the answer was, well, we have a whole series of shortfalls: resources, coordination, and authority. So what we're looking at was problems with an uneven creation of power across the system, what I suppose in the UK we would call limited government bandwidth. The leadership is unable to attend to all of the priorities at the same time. Therefore, some are created, some elements achieve their targets, and others do not. The result of this is that from about the middle of the decade, there's been significant pressure on the system from the leadership, the Russian bureaucracy. Pressure being put on the bureaucracy by the leadership. A series of firings and reshuffles of senior personnel, reorganization of meeting structures, expanded government structures, and so on, to try to oversee plans being implemented, and a shift in the political landscape. So a series of new organizations have been established. The two that I mention and explore in more depth in the book are the Russian Popular Front and the National Defense Management Center. Certainly a whole series of problems remain. As one journalist on state TV pointed out, why plans are not implemented is not really asked, because people are well familiar with this: a lack of money, a lack of competence among officials, I quote, bureaucratic foot dragging, corruption, and the overall difficult situation. But what we do have, and I think this is where I'll bring my remarks to a conclusion and await your questions. What we do have is the basis of a strategic agenda, substantially set out in a cascade of documents. The real question is the execution of this, not the planning, and this is where we see a certain dysfunction, as I say. Breaking that into a trajectory, we see the period where, from about the 2000s, where planning is deeply flawed as is implementation. But increasing consistency in planning from about the mid-2000s, which has led to not only legislation structuring strategic planning, but also two now overhauls of all the documentation. And since the mid-2010s, increasing effectiveness in a number of sectors, particularly in defense. The two primary conclusions, therefore, are that first, the Russian landscape, political, security, economic, is changing quite significantly. Although we see Mr. Putin at the top and a number of long-term personnel there alongside him, we see quite a lot of turnover in individuals, but also the changing shape of the Russian landscape, so the creation of new organizations, the emergence to greater power of others. And the second is that the strategy is the useful tool for understanding, the useful intellectual tool for understanding where Russia is going. I often hear discussions of, lists of Russian strengths and weaknesses, for instance. We can discuss that all day, really. There are numerous strengths and even more weaknesses. Similarly, there's a big discussion about is Russia resurgent or in decline? These don't really help us to understand where the Russian leadership seeks to take us. What we're seeing really is Russia's re-emergence on the world stage, flawed, difficult again, setback occasionally, but Russia appearing in not only the Middle East, but across Africa, Latin America, in the Asia-Pacific region, Russian activity in the Indian Ocean and Antarctica also. So we see a state that has re-emerged on the global horizon and is acting as a ubiquitous power. And that is why it's essential to understand Russian strategy and the priorities, not just the priorities in planning, which guide policy, but also the shortfalls, the difficulties, and the tensions within the implementation of plans. And on that note, I will draw to a conclusion and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for that absolutely fascinating talk. So the first question is, what were your hopes in writing both The New Politics of Russia and Power in Modern Russia?
The hopes of finding a reader actually probably would be the first slightly cynical observation. But the point is to try to shift conversation about Russia into a more detailed and sophisticated direction. What I really hope to try to achieve with the new politics of Russia, for instance, was to look into Russia beyond Vladimir Putin. So often we end up hearing about Mr. Putin this, Mr. Putin that. Is Putin going today? Is, as though that Mr. Putin is the only individual in Russia. So new politics of Russia try to draw a slightly more sophisticated picture of this, setting out the chain of the landscape in more detail, looking into some Kremlinology and so on, and how we might go about understanding Russia more in a more nuanced way. The second one was really to dig into this question of providing an answer to that question of Russian strategy. Where is Russia going? Why? And both of the two can, I suppose, be seen as, yes, volume 1 and volume 2, although they weren't really conceived of in that direction. So direct answer, new politics of Russia to broaden the scope, power in modern Russia to try to explore how things do not work as much as they do.
Okay, fab, thanks very much. And we have another question. Thanks, Andrew. What overlay is there between Russian strategy and British or US strategy? Is there a fight for supremacy on the international stage, or is there alignment, joint work, influence, and so on at work here?
I don't think there is a question of alignment, I'm afraid. I think there is increasingly a sense of dissonance. In fact, that's one of the things I ended up discussing in New Politics as well. This a sense of increasing strategic and dissonance between Russia and the Euro-Atlantic community. The wide range of disagreements we have, policy disagreements from domestic politics to international affairs, European security, to how things look in the Middle East. So in many ways, what you see is a great series of disagreements that is causing friction between the two strategies, between how Russia wants to position itself on the world stage and how the UK and the US position themselves. One of the things I try to look at in that sense through this lens of grand strategy is how, for instance, we might extend it to think about if the UK is going to pursue the idea of global Britain, where are we going to bump up against the Russians? How is this going to translate into our relationship with Russia? Because most of the UK's relationship with Russia and thinking about Russia is very Eurocentric. So we tend to look at the Baltic states, our allies, our NATO allies there. We tend to look at Ukraine, the war going there. But actually, a whole series of other problems are going to emerge further afield. And my view, for instance, is that the UK and Russia are going to end up competing because our strategies are based on different understandings of international affairs that will start to compete over the global commons. I think we'll start to see more competition, disagreement perhaps over Antarctica. So a global Britain versus a global Russia is how it's worth examining this question, I think. And that's why, again, working out Russian priorities and resources and capabilities within their strategy is a useful way of understanding that dissonance and great power competition.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Another question. Thank you very much for your talk. You mentioned that Russia has become better at planning, but still has problems with implementation due to bureaucratic politics, etc. Are most ministries not being involved in coming up with the planning of the strategies in the first place?
Most ministries are involved in coming up with their own strategies, yes, but there is a structure that often goes through, and that includes for instance, going through the Security Council. So a lot of the problem is that ministries will use strategic planning as internal negotiation points. So they will veto and hold up agreement on others in order to get their own benefits. As I say, a sort of departmentalitis in Russia. So, but most ministries do end up writing their own plans. Yes, it's that coordination at the slightly higher level that is problematic.
And we have another question from this attendee. You mentioned that the goal of strategy is to create power. Which type of power, material, immaterial, coercive, etc., do you have in mind here?
Mostly material power. Mostly material power. I think that the primary stage of Russian strategy, the first stage, which I address in the book, and the next stage, which I'm looking at now, are both about trying to make the system function. So stage one is that greater efficiency, greater effectiveness, I should say, in implementation. So it's material power, bringing Russia into as I say, into the 21st century. A lot of the infrastructure is decrepit and limited. That's an essential part of it first. It is worth noticing, though, and mentioning the discussion that the Russian leadership is having with the spirit of the nation, trying to create a degree of political legitimacy and so on, reaching out through to the role of the Russian Orthodox Church, the creation of organizations like Unarmia, Youth Army, which creates a sort of a patriotic-minded youth. So in some senses, we are moving from the material now, material stage one into material stage two, but there is also, I think, a sense of something beyond that now too. Yes.
Thank you very much. And we have another question. Andrew, you mentioned Russia's increasing effectiveness in defence. What were the key success factors in more successful implementation here, and are they likely to be applied to other areas?
First of all, I mean, the defence overhaul is I think is noteworthy because it's a decade's worth of effort that has gone into three things. First, re-equipment, second, reform, and third, rehearsal. So it's a very useful way of watching how this is created, because the Russian armed forces were in some disarray, I think, we can say in the mid to late 2000s, with lots of old equipment and old basing capabilities and so on. So the very vigorous effort to go into modernizing them has resulted in a whole series of new capabilities, modernized capabilities, and specifically new ones. But why this is important to my mind is that we're looking at the organization of the whole of the state. So we're not simply looking at, let's say, the modernization of the Air Force or ground forces. We're talking about creating coherence across the whole state. So some of their exercises, some of their big yearly annual exercises involve civilian ministries. You can look at the Ministry of Transport, the Ministry of Communications, Health, but also bringing in other organizations, Central Bank of Russia and so on. So what you're seeing is an attempt to try to create coordinated power, not just across defense, but across the whole state. And that includes civilian authorities and at the federal, regional and local levels also. So for me, that focus on defense is a Russian priority. That is what is examined first and dealt with primarily by the Russian state. And you can see that method being rolled out. So the creation at the opening, the building and then the opening in 2014 of the National Defense Management Center, in my view, is one of the examples and illustrations of how the Russian leadership is trying to coordinate much more and address this problem of conducting the orchestra. So I think the effectiveness in defence is that's how it has taken shape, and are we going to see that rolled out perhaps more across other state organs? Yes, I think state areas. I think so. Yes.
Thank you very much. And another question: is Russia a serious threat to the West?
Is Russia a serious threat to the West? It's a good question, and not an easy one to answer, because in the end, what we look at is Russia going to invade Europe? At the moment, I see no great evidence for this. It's been a concern for much of this decade, but I think there's a lot of political push and shove. I mean, great power push and shove and unpleasant politics and so on, but not the same as a direct threat to, let's say, an invasion of NATO. Is there a threat in the way that the Russians go about their business? Is a slightly different question. Are we going to see continued Russian activity in domestic politics, trying to find out what's going on and interfering in politics across the world? Will there be continued Russian cyber activity and so on? The answer to that is yes, because I think the Russian leadership sees itself as participating in a game, an international game that is underway, of everyone interfering in everyone else's politics, and the cyber question, also cyber security being used by most other states which have the capabilities. So Russia will continue to do so. So at one level, I think the answer is no, in terms of I don't see an invasion of the Euro-Atlantic community. In another sense, is it a threat to in respect to some of the ways we go about our political business, yes, you could certainly say it's a challenge. I'd rather use the word challenge than threat, I must admit. And of course, in the end, if our policies end up disagreeing significantly, the bigger picture is, of course, that Russia is as I said earlier, is reaching out beyond its own interests. It views the Russian leadership views its interests as being beyond the Russian borders, and that, I think, is going to be an area of significant and increasing disagreement. And therefore we may end up with much more competition, and therefore Russia will end up posing more of a challenge to the way we seek to do business. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question from an attendee which sort of follows on from that last question. On the basis of your analysis, do you think the West and Russia can cooperate? Can a middle ground between the two be found?
Yes, I think so, but not in the immediate term, and not over some of the bigger, the major questions that are in our politics. Do I think there will be cooperation in European security, for instance? The answer to that, I'm afraid, is no. We disagree so fundamentally that it's very difficult to see how common ground, or rather I should say shared ground, will be achieved. I think if we were to look at, are there areas for dialogue, let's say, and let's talk dialogue before we talk cooperation, because I think the relationship is so negative at the moment that cooperation is a fair way away. Are there areas that we could consider, we could conceive of dialogue? Yes. But that will require a bit of a shift of imagination. That will require a shift in our own policies, and a degree of shift in Russia's policies too. Let me give you a couple of examples about where you might find tangible interaction, because I think these are shared interests. The first is in urbanization and demography. So in many ways, Russia faces similar challenges to those we face across Europe, of an aging population that is perhaps becoming more and more urbanized. It's not immediately clear that the Russian leadership understands this question better than we do. So what we're talking about is relatively low-level technical issues, whereby you can begin to create interaction between the two sides. Another example might be climate change and the impact it has on infrastructure. Now, this hopefully illustrates what I mean by the ambiguity of dialogue and cooperation. I'm not at all sure that London or Washington or Brussels and Moscow would politically agree on climate change, for instance. But I think it's very clear that the Russian leadership understands the practical ramifications of climate change. They face them daily or seasonally with floods and fires. So there may be some scope for practical interaction there, again, on a technical level and between practitioners rather than politicians. I think at the moment both sides, when I look at, let's say, London and Moscow, what I see is two sides at the end of a long corridor, each at one end, holding the door open, saying, yes, we're very keen to cooperate with you. We invite you to come through. So if you agree to do what we want to do, we will agree and we can work together. And of course, the same is reciprocal. Both are requiring the other to reverse their position almost 180 degrees. That's why I think that cooperation is going to be rather more difficult, except in some initially localized and initially technical areas. And I think really what we're looking at is the middle of the decade as a minimum before this kind of cooperation becomes really fruitful. So almost at the next generation of leaders as they come through.
Thank you very much. And we have another question. Do we know anything about the degree to which Russian influence is integrated into the British and US state?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and again, rather an ambiguous one. I think it would be worth waiting for the House of Commons report to be published in terms of seeing the political aspects. When we say, perhaps I could ask for a clarification, what you mean by the British and the American state? Do we mean politics? Do we mean the civil service and so on? Because I think you can see possibly a bit of a divergence between those two. You might say, for instance, that civil service in the UK, or the armed forces in the UK and in the US, have a very clear position that well, there is no real Russian influence integrated into those bodies. Is Russian activity more active? Is there more Russian activity involved in across the board in political environment? Very possibly, yes, very possibly. But I wouldn't wish to push that too far. I think there is undoubtedly in the UK, for instance, a sense of Russian money in the UK, but I wouldn't go as far as say that the Russian leadership necessarily had overwhelming influence in how the British electorate votes, or what the British government in the end seeks to do.
Okay, thank you very much. And we have another question. Andrew, how would you summarize Russia's key current strategic goals?
A good question. I think how I would summarize this is to establish themselves in every part of the globe. That doesn't mean as a dominant role. That means have a role to play in every major question. Why I say this is because I think that we often get focused on our own terminology, and Russia is a great power and so on. That does relate to the Russian discussion to a degree. But if you look at Russian geography effectively is placed as the largest state in the world, which straddles a large portion of the globe. And I tend to think of the Russian leadership being less interested in being a great power, perhaps, as being a ubiquitous power, that understand that their geography actually means they have interests across the globe. Certainly explicitly, they've said that they want to be involved in every major question. Now, I think in some senses there is a Turkish diplomat's quote that could be taken off here and used to say that if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu, would be a good way of describing this. That they want to be involved every major question. So they are currently appearing in every region. And we are being surprised by this because we're not really paying attention to Russian strategy. We were surprised by Russian activity in Europe, then in the Middle East, then we were surprised when they turned up in Africa, and so on. And I think the next surprise will be one that the Russians have appeared in the Indian Ocean. But actually the Russians are there already and active in the Indian Ocean. So almost a sense of pre-positioning is the answer. Pre-positioning, trying to get them their forward positioning out into each and every region of the globe.
Thank you very much. And this is quite a long question. And to what extent is the challenge from Russia driven by its perception of Western policy as threatening to and directed against Russia? Do you think Western policymakers understand how our policies are seen from a Russian perspective? If opportunities to move to collaborative dialogue in the short term are limited, are there alternatives that can help us to minimize the risk of misunderstanding and competition through adversarial rather than cooperative dialogue, for instance?
I think it's a very good question. I think that the part of the problem is that both sides interpret the others as a threat. So I think a lot of what I talk about in the book is indeed focused on the idea of Russian leadership trying to prepare itself for a very competitive 2020, as I mentioned. A lot of that, as they themselves repeatedly state, is their view that there will be competition over energy resources, transit routes, access to markets, and so on. Competition that will be dominated by the United States, for instance. A particularly interesting aspect of this is how the Russian leadership understands energy. And so we see, for instance, in the recent Russian energy strategy, the discussion that oil pricing in some senses is less important than protection of markets, which are under threat from US energy production and export. So do I think that particular question, this is a national security question for Russia because a large part of their budget is based on hydrocarbons and hydrocarbon export. So do I think that our leadership see these questions in these terms? The answer to that is no. I don't think that's the case. We define the Russian question much more rather differently. So are Russian perspectives well understood here in policy terms or media terms? I'm not sure that that's particularly true. Are there measures for addressing this and creating means for coping with misunderstanding? Well, there are methods for dialogue, yes, and I think it's important that our leadership should engage with Russia. I have no problem with, for instance, our Prime Minister meeting with Russian leadership and hammering it out with them, that our disagreements primarily. I don't think we should be particularly afraid of that. I think they should be prepared also to go to Moscow and to have the Russians disagree with us. But it will require a sustainment of dialogue at that higher level, regardless of the disagreements. I'm not very hopeful of that happening, I must admit.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question. Andrew, do you have similar insights into China's strategic goals and effectiveness of implementation? And if so, how does Russia compare?
No, I'm afraid not. Sorry, Russia's hard enough to try to understand. So I wouldn't dare to try to pass myself off as a sinologist. Sorry. I think I have to be honest about that. Apologies.
Don't worry. Moving on to another question. How do you think Russia will cope with COVID-19, given the centralization of politics in Moscow and the size of the country?
Interesting question again. And I think this is, of course, this is a live question. And it's something I've partially been following, but it is worth looking into in some sophistication, in some depth, because at the same time as COVID, and I would be quite keen to emphasize this point, as much as COVID, how the Russian leadership is coping with a triple challenge at the same time is really the question. Now, I don't wish to bend the question too far to shape, but I do want to emphasize that it's not just COVID. There are two other things that are going on at the same time as well. One of which is the oil price war on the one hand, and the other is the dealing with the floods and fires in the Russian regions. So you could easily look at this as a multifaceted crisis in Russia. Returning to what that means, as I've been looking at it, I have seen, for instance, the way, in some senses, the system might have been used. So the creation of National Defense Management Center and these various other questions illustrate in some ways the problems that I'm trying to share in the book. The flawed vertical of power, the difficulty of coordinating resources, and so on and so forth. The National Defense Management Center does, in theory, create and coordinate bringing the military in to try to deal with a civilian question as well, so coordination of resources. But there are shortfalls in funding in certain places, in equipment in other places, perhaps people not always implementing the instructions as fully as possible. So two answers really to that question. First is, please don't look at it as a COVID-19 question alone, because I don't think that's how things might be understood in Russia. That's a segment of a broader current question. The second is the algorithm set out by the book is there. There are plans and means of trying to do this. They've got government bodies set up. They've got resources that they are putting towards it in a degree, and that the methods of communication are there. But the response is flawed. Is flawed, I think.
Thank you very much. Another question. Your books make a number of comments on the demise of Russian studies in the UK and US following the end of the Cold War. Do you think this area, both research and teaching, will flourish again now that the globalization and neoliberalism are in chaos and the world order is beginning to crack?
I'd like to be able to say yes. And I do think that certainly since I wrote The New Politics of Russia, and even since I wrote The Power in Modern Russia, there is a shift in structure of Russia studies, because there were comparatively very few people looking at Russia in 2012, 2013, certainly within government, in Washington and in London, in NATO and across Europe. That is changing quite substantially. That's changing quite substantially. So there are more people now in UK government and in the US who are tasked to look at Russia. I do think, though, there are some ongoing questions about this. First of all, is that we see certain areas which require significant expertise. So there are general aspects of foreign politics, there are general aspects of domestic politics and so on, which are relatively easy to grasp if you spend time looking at it, if you learn the language and you prepare your work with thorough approach to the sources. But there are others which will take much longer to come to grips with, and that does mean things like Russian military activity, Russian economics, Russian activity in space, and so on and so forth. These are questions which I wonder whether there is still sufficient knowledge on, and we see really a tracking of quite fashionable questions. For instance, Russian propaganda and so on, which I think is a whole new area of study, which has become very popular. But again, we're not really seeing expertise in other areas, such as Russia's foreign policy with regards to specific regions, let's say with Iran or with Turkey or with others. So there is a growth in the business, but it is located to specific areas only, rather than a more detailed and across the board study. And I would say it's an interesting point about liberalism being in decline, and perhaps this works. Perhaps this will work to revive the Russia studies. I'm not at all sure. We'll find out in 2 or 3 years' time, I suppose. But I think that there will be again different subjects competing for attention. I suspect there will be a greater interest in China, for instance, renewed interest in India and democracy in the Indian Ocean, and so on. Other regional questions, all competing for the attention of PhD students and young researchers alike. So a mixed picture in answer to your question.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think this is a good moment to wrap up this armchair event and thank everyone for attending, but also thank you, Andrew, for giving up your time to participate in this armchair event.